Hello and welcome to AE Accounting Tutorials. Today we are continuing our series on IAS 36, Impairment of Assets. In this video, I want us to take a full practice question on how to allocate impairment losses to a cash generating unit. But remember that in our previous lesson or previous video, we learned about how to test for impairment. That is how to calculate impairment loss and impairment reversals if possible. But remember that for impairment reversals, there are certain criteria that must be met before we'll be able to arrive at an impairment reversals. But our focus today is to learn how to allocate an impairment losses to a cash generating unit. Is that okay? So if you are new to this channel, I will encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Also comment on this channel for us to know where you are watching us from and probably how this video has helped you. Before we go through the question together, because the question is on a cash generating unit, we need to first of all understand the basic concept with regards to a cash generating unit before we go through the question. When we say cash generating unit, what does it mean? A cash generating unit, according to IAS 36, is the smallest identifiable group of assets that generates a cash inflow from the continual use of the assets without depending on the cash inflow of other group of assets. Is that okay? So if any group of assets is able to generate a cash inflow to the entity or to the business without depending on the cash inflow of other assets, we call those group of assets a cash generating unit. Is that okay? So when we test for impairment on a cash generating unit and we arrive at an impairment loss, the question is, how do we allocate the impairment losses to the individual assets within the cash generating unit? So for instance, when we have building, we have plant and machinery. Let's say we have goodwill. Let's say we have $300, $100, then we have $200, making a total of $600. So if these three assets is the cash generating unit, a cash generating unit. Is that okay? These two assets are tangible non-current assets and the goodwill is intangible non-current assets. If this form the cash generating unit, and for instance we calculated an impairment loss of $300, we tested for an impairment on this 600 and we have $300. How are we going to allocate this $300 to this cash generating unit? We can just subtract it from the total and arrive at a net carrying amount of $300. But that is not the case under IAS 36. There is a criteria for allocating the impairment loss to the individual assets. The general rule is that when we are to allocate an impairment loss to a cash generating unit, if there is an intangible non-current asset, for instance goodwill, as part of the assets in the cash generating unit, we allocate the impairment loss to the intangible non-current asset first before we allocate it to the other current assets. Okay, but how do we also allocate it to the other tangible non-current asset? We do that on a pro rata basis. And I will explain this concept as well. We are saying that we allocate it to the intangible non-current asset first, and the intangible non-current asset here is the goodwill. So it means that this total impairment loss, we will subtract it from the total impairment loss is 300. We can only take off the 200. Okay, then there will be 0 for goodwill after impairment. Is that okay? Then the remaining 100, when we take this 200 from this, the remaining will be $100. Then we have to allocate this $100 to these two assets. And how do we do that? We do that on pro rata basis. Okay, the pro rata basis has to do with either we do it in a fraction form or in a ratio form. Okay, to do that, we have to take the total, the remaining impairment loss over the total tangible non-current asset remaining. So we can have 100, we add this to will be $400. This will give us 1:4. So for us to get an impairment loss for building, we multiply the ratio by the 300, the initial carrying amount. To get the same amount for plant and machinery, we have 1/4 multiplied by 100. Is that okay? That is how we go by the pro rata basis. But take note that when the intangible non-current assets are more than one, for instance, patent is included to this goodwill, we also allocate the impairment loss to them on a pro rata basis. Is that okay? Before we go to the tangible non-current assets. So let's go through the question together and see how we can allocate the impairment loss to the cash generating unit. An entity has a cash generating unit with a carrying value and their corresponding value in use for the year ended 31st December 2022. We have three different assets. Building has a carrying amount of $200,000. Its value in use is $150,000. Plant and equipment has a carrying value of $180,000. Value in use being $120,000. Goodwill is $100,000 for carrying amount, $80,000 for value in use. Required: calculate the impairment loss and show how it will be allocated to the cash generating unit. Alright, so this is the question, and the requirement says that we should calculate for an impairment loss, and then after that we show how it will be allocated. But our focus here is on the allocation. For testing for an impairment is something very simple we've done in our previous video. What we have to know when we want to calculate for impairment is that we need to know our carrying amount, then we know the recoverable amount. We say that when we want to test for impairment, we will have an impairment loss. An impairment loss when the carrying amount of an asset is greater than that of the recoverable amount. Okay, so when this happens, the answer is what we call the impairment loss. So you can say that when we subtract a recoverable amount of the asset from the carrying amount of the assets, then we arrive at the impairment loss. Is that okay? Meaning carrying amount has to be greater than the recoverable amount. On the other hand, this simply means that the answer must be positive before we have an impairment loss. And from this question, we've been given the carrying value or carrying amount of the individual asset in the cash generating unit, and we've been given their corresponding recoverable amount as well. Is that okay? Very good. Our focus is on the allocation. Is that okay? How to determine the recoverable amount when it is not given directly? We've learned that in our previous video. So our focus here is to do the allocation. But before we do the allocation, we have to calculate the impairment loss of the individual assets in the cash generating unit. So to present the solution in a very formal way, we begin with the name of the assets. Okay, we have different assets, then we look at their carrying values. Okay, after the carrying value, then we consider the recoverable amount. After the recoverable amount, what we need is the impairment loss. Is that okay? All in dollars. Very good. The first asset from the question is building. The second is plant and equipment. The third asset is goodwill. Okay, these are the three assets, and we've been given the carrying value in the question with their corresponding recoverable amount. So to get the impairment loss, we just subtract the recoverable amount from the carrying amount. So from the question, we have the carrying value for land being $200,000. For plant and machinery is $180,000. We have goodwill carrying value being $100,000. After that, we write the recoverable amount from the question. Is that okay? And that is $150,000. And then we have $120,000. And also we have $80,000. Is that okay? So to get the impairment loss, we just subtract the recoverable amount from the carrying amount. So we have 5,000, 50,000 for land as impairment loss. We have 60,000 for plant and machinery. Then we have 20,000 for goodwill. So now to determine the total impairment loss, we add these three. Is that okay? So these three will give us $130,000. Is that okay? So the initial carrying value of the assets, the total here is $480,000. So we are done with the first part of the question by calculating the impairment loss of the cash generating units. These three assets are the cash generating units. They are generating a cash inflow into the business or the entity from the continual use of these assets without depending on the cash flow of other group of assets. That is why we say these assets are a cash generating unit. So the total impairment loss of the cash generating unit is $130,000. So the question now comes is that how do we allocate this total impairment losses to the individual assets? Is that okay? So that is the allocation. So the second part has to do with the allocation of impairment loss. Allocation of impairment loss. So we have the assets, we have building, we have plant and machinery, or plant and equipment rather. Then we have goodwill as the intangible non-current assets. So we have the carrying value of the asset before impairment. So I'll say before impairment, or this means before impairment. Is that okay? Then we have the impairment loss itself. The impairment loss itself. Then we have after impairment. Sorry, or in dollars. Is that okay? So we have before impairment, the carrying value before impairment, then the impairment allocation, then we have after impairment, the carrying value of the asset after impairment. Is that okay? All right. So before impairment, the carrying values here are the same. So we have 200,000. For building, we have 180,000. For plant and equipment, and we have 100,000 for goodwill. Very good. So the next thing to do is the allocation of the impairment loss. According to IAS 36, the general rule is that when we are to allocate an impairment loss to a cash generating unit, we allocate it to the intangible non-current asset first. In this case, it is only goodwill. So if the intangible non-current asset is only one, we do the allocation direct. But if it is more than one, we do it on a pro rata basis. In this case, it is only one. So the total impairment loss is 130. So we allocate the impairment loss to this initial carrying amount. Okay, you see that the objective of this standard says that an asset should not be recognized above its recoverable amount. Is that okay? So impairment loss will be subtracted from the initial carrying value to get the closing carrying value or the exact recoverable amount that will be recognized in the statement of financial position, because we don't want to recognize the asset above its recoverable amount. So to do that, we have to subtract the impairment loss from the initial carrying value. So we allocate, the total is 130, we allocate the $100,000 to goodwill, so that after impairment, after allocation, there will be no value for goodwill. If we take out the 100 we've already allocated minus 100,000, the remaining is $30,000. The question now comes is, how do we allocate the remaining 30,000 of an impairment loss to the remaining tangible non-current assets? That is what I said, we do that on a pro rata basis. So on a pro rata basis, the pro rata basis has to do with the total remaining impairment loss over the remaining assets. So we have 30,000 impairment loss over the remaining assets. We have to do the allocation. This plus this give us 380,000. So the ratio or the fraction here has to do with 3 out of 38. So we use this ratio to do the allocation. So to get an impairment loss for building, we apply the fraction, that is 3 over 38 multiplied by the value of the building to get an impairment loss. And this will give us 15,798 when we multiply 3 out of 38 to this amount. When we multiply the 3 out of 38 to the plant and equipment value, we will get 14,211. So this is how we do the allocation. We do that on a pro rata basis. Very good. I said to get this value, we do 3 out of the 38 multiplied by the 200,000. That is to get this value. And to get this value, we still do the fraction multiplied by the 180,000. This is what we've done. Is that okay? Very good. So with the impairment loss, we subtract. And you have nothing for goodwill. For plant and equipment, we will have an amount of 165,789 when we subtract this from this. Then when we subtract this from this, you have an amount of 184,211. That is when we subtract this from this. Is that okay? So this is how we do the allocation of the impairment loss. So to know if you are right, okay, we add this value, and add this value. Okay, the total of this we get 480,000. That is the initial carrying value. Is that okay? Then when we add this impairment loss we allocated, we need to get the total impairment loss. Is that okay? That is 130,000. We are subtracting this from this, but when we add these two, we arrive at an amount of $350,000. That is where we subtract this from this. Is that okay? So basically, this is how we allocate an impairment losses to a cash generating unit. So take note that for impairment losses, we subtract it from the initial carrying value. But when it comes to an impairment reversals, we only add it back to the initial carrying value. Is that okay? So you can try that on your own. In our next video, we'll be taking a question on how to calculate or how to test for impairment or calculate an impairment loss when the recoverable amount is not given. Is that okay? In this question, recoverable amount is given, but we will take a question where we will take into consideration time value of money, where we will use the discounted cash flow method to determine the recoverable amount. Is that okay? So you just subscribe to this channel, make sure you turn on your notification bell so that the next video you will get an alert on your devices. Until we meet for our next video, I think it is bye for now.